In this week's video, I will be demonstrating how to knit a swatch in the round. Hello and welcome to the Crimson Stitchery, a video channel about making all things beautiful and useful. My name is Anushka and you can find relevant links for this video in the down bar here below on YouTube. Let's get started, but first a cup of tea. Today I'm going to make myself a gingerbread chai loose leaf tea, kindly sent to me by Bird and Blend. This is a spiced rooibos tea and I really enjoy the little mallow flowers inside, which are just a little bit of fun. Of course, all the cinnamony and ginger flavours are also delicious, and sometimes it's good to have a caffeine-free drink. Thank you, Bird and Blend. I'll put a link to their website in the YouTube description box. In this video, I'll be covering how to create a swatch knitted in the round, and I'm going to be demonstrating creating a swatch using stocking stitch but knitted in the round. This video is part of a longer video series all about swatching, and if you haven't already, make sure that you go back and watch the videos that came before this. The first one called Why Bother Knitting a Swatch, which covers all of the basics all about swatching, tension and gauge. And the next instalment where I demonstrated how to knit this swatch here, which is stocking stitch knit flat. That video covers a lot of the basics about how to create a swatch and also talks about tension in a little bit more depth too. So the way that I create swatches in the round, they end up looking like this. So we have our stocking stitch on the front, and then behind we've got these long tails of yarn. So you can see that just like in my basic stocking stitch swatch, I've also got a garter stitch border at the bottom and the top and on each side. And it's really important to create this border for swatches in the round because they basically allow the changes in tension and the messiness at the edge to happen in a stitch pattern that you are not measuring. It's just in garter stitch, and they just keep it flat as well because stocking stitch will curl otherwise, and just make it a little bit easier to handle. And why do I have these tails at the back? Well, I'll be coming to that in a moment. So you might be wondering why it's important to create swatches in the round. Essentially, when you are making swatches, it's really important to use all of the techniques, methods and tools that you're going to be using for your main knitting project. And if your main knitting project includes any section that's in the round, then it's really important that you've also done a swatch in the round and measured your tension. So for example, sometimes you can get cardigan patterns where the main body is knit flat back and forth, and then you might pick up stitches for the sleeves and the actual sleeve portion is knit in the round. Therefore, you've actually got two types of knitting and you need to check out the tension for both of those. Obviously, for things like hats, mittens, stuff like that are all in the round, then you've just got to start off swatching in the round to begin with. And the reason that it's so important that you swatch in the round, if that's how your project is going to be created in, is because of the tension changes that often occur between the knit stitch and the purl stitch. So when we are knitting stocking net flat, we knit across on the right side, and then when we turn around, we purl back to our cast on point. And purling is essentially knitting backwards, but according to the exact method of knitting and the way that you hold the yarn personally, quite often your tension will change in between having the yarn at the back for knitting and having the yarn at the front, and also just the way that you manipulate the stitch and the way that the yarn is flowing around your hand. And we saw this really clearly in the last video demonstration where I knit this swatch, in that we saw that the purl stitches were really loose and that this type of yarn actually really highlighted those changes in tension because it is a single ply. So sometimes the changes in tension are really, really small, and other times, as I've alluded, according to the actual yarn construction, they can just appear more subtle. They just might not be as obvious. But most of the time, I would say they do happen, and it's pretty normal. Unless you're, a perfect 10 out of 10 knitter, it's pretty normal that your tension will change and fluctuate according to every single new technique that you do, but also according to your own, state of mind, state of being while you're doing the knitting. Maybe you really enjoy purling and you want to race to the end because you love it, and that might make the tension speed up, or maybe you hate it or maybe you find it really difficult, so the yarn is becoming very, very loose, or know, whatever reason it is, it's all going to be just very, very individual and I can't predict it. But I've just given you a few scenarios where I've found that that's happened for me. So when you are knitting in the round, you don't turn your work, right? So if you want to create stocking stitch, you don't turn your work and purl back. But if your piece of fabric is connected in the round like that, you're basically knitting around and always facing the right side. You're not turning the work and purling back, which means that you're always doing the knit stitch, and that's what allows the stitches to stack up in this V formation with only using the knitted stitch and not having to purl and do it the other way around. So because there's a difference in tension generally between knits and purls, when you're knitting in the round, you're only doing knits. And that might mean that your tension is slightly tighter or it could be slightly looser, but overall it's going to be a difference because you're only doing that knit stitch. So it's really important to work a swatch up where you're only doing the knit stitch. It's essentially a different fabric. Now, the way that you could swatch in the round is to cast on a tube and just knit up a small tube in a small circumference. But I, like many other knitters, don't really like doing that. And the reason for that is because you need quite a large swatch to begin with. You need a swatch that's at least 6 inches square or 15 centimeters. And if you're knitting a full tube, that's basically double the amount of work. It would be 12 inches in circumference or 30 centimeters, which is quite a significant piece of knitting to be doing on just a swatch or a sample. So this is where these loops in the back come in, because once I've knit all the way across the length of the stitches, instead of, you know, casting on and knitting more stitches in the back, all I do is carry the yarn across the piece until it takes me back to the start, and then I can knit again those stitches from right to left, carry the yarn across, and so on and so forth. And I'm leaving enough yarn at the back so that the piece can lie flat at the end. There are different options here. You could just carry a very short tail and then you could snip them open, but I like to keep them dangling at the back because for me there's just a little bit of a safety net where I could, if I needed to, unravel the yarn and re-knit with it or whatever. If you've got plenty of yarn, if this is not of a concern to you, then you know you don't have to have such a long length of slack at the back. I'm using the same yarn as before, which is Retreat, kindly sent to me by West Yorkshire Spinners, and the same needles as before, which are 6.5mm higher sharp needles. And I'm using a circular needle, as you can see. And I think it's going to be interesting to make a comparison at the end between the flat swatch and the round swatch using exactly the same needles and exactly the same yarn. So I'm going to start off in the same way, which is by casting on the same amount of stitches, 30 stitches as before, and I'm going to knit my garter stitch edging flat. And the reason that I'm doing that is because it's a bit easier. I can just knit back and forth, back and forth. Knitting garter stitch in the round isn't so fun because you actually have to purl. So I'm just going to knit my garter stitch flat. Okay, so now I'm all set up and ready to go with my swatch in the round. I've done my 4 rows of garter stitch, which I've done by knitting back and forth, so I have done that flat. And then I've just knit all the way across so that I'm ready to do my first row in the round. So when I just finished knitting, my stitches basically looked like this. All of the stitches had been knitted across onto the right hand side needle, and I need to get my stitches essentially back onto the left hand side needle, ready to be knit again. At the moment my last stitch was at the end here, and I need to get the working yarn back to this side, which is the beginning. So the way I'm going to do that is simply by sliding the stitches all the way across. So I've just slid those stitches all the way along the needle. My working yarn is still on the left there, and I need to bring it round to the right. So I'm doing that by loosely stretching a length of yarn behind, and then I'm just grasping it using my left hand. So I'm allowing that yarn to dangle at the bottom there. And I promise that after you get this set up for a couple of rounds, it's going to become much more straightforward. So I'm holding this working yarn and pinching it with my fingers at the right hand side. Now I'm going to take the end of the working yarn that is connected to the ball here with my right hand, and I'm going to knit my first row in the round. Now I've got to keep my first 3 and my last 3 stitches in garter stitch. So because we're working in the round, we're going to purl the first 3 stitches, just the first 3, and that's creating our garter stitch border. Now put the yarn to the back and I'm going to knit all the way across. So I've knit now all the way across to the last 3 stitches that haven't been knit, and you can see straight away that the very last one has gone quite wonky and loose, but I'm going to ignore that. I'm not worried about the tension of these 3 stitches at all because they're just the border. Now I'll bring my yarn to the front and I'll purl across those to keep them in garter stitch. Don't care that this tension has gone super loose, I'm really not bothered about it. Just knit it. I might tug on that yarn at the back very gently just to tighten it, but not in any significant way. I'm not yanking it. Now I finished knitting across and I need to push these stitches along the length of the cable to the other needle. And gently push the stitches towards the edge of the needle. I'm going to very gently take the working yarn and hold it across, just pinching it with my fingers there. Now I'm ready to pick up the empty needle in the right hand and knit across again. So because I purled those 3 stitches, I'm ready to knit. And on this row, I'm going to be recording my needle size, just like I did when I knitted the swatch flat. So I have a 6.5mm needle, so I'm going to do 6 yarn overs and knit 2 togethers. And now I'm going to do 2 purl bumps in order to represent the 0.5 millimeter, with every purl representing 1/4. So I recorded the needle size in those stitches, and now I'm just going to knit across to the end. Now my last stitch has gone super loose, so I'm just very gently tugging it in. Let go of this needle, bring it to the other side and slide my stitches across. And now very gently bring the working yarn back. And I'm ready to knit another row. And this row needs to start and end with 3 purled stitches in order to keep the garter stitch border. So I'm knitting across my yarn over, knit 2 together markers, just knitting all the way to the end. And sliding the stitches back across. So now you can begin to see the loops of yarn that are being held across the back. And you've got to be careful not to yank the yarn too tightly across, because otherwise your swatch is not going to lie flat. It can feel a little bit tangled up and like an octopus at this point, but just persevere. Another quick tip, as well as being careful not to pull the yarn too tightly across the back of the work, just be really careful with these first 3 and last 3 loose garter stitches. It's really tempting to just pull those in and tighten them up, but make sure that you don't do that. I have learned firsthand that if you yank really hard at the end stitches of the borders, that tension adjustment can actually rebound, if you like. It can ricochet across the row, with many more stitches becoming distorted and having an overly tight tension. So that's why I've been suggesting that you just very carefully make very controlled adjustments at the end, just pulling it very gently, and then just kind of ignore that garter stitch border, because that's basically what it's for. Those stitches are there because they are sloppy. That's why we're keeping them in garter stitch. We're keeping them distinct from the main portion of the swatch. Now that you've got the sense of the main premise, you might be wondering why I've been knitting with this circular needle, especially as you can see the cord is quite stiff and the needles are kind of jumping around a little bit. But I wanted to show you the way that I actually knit this swatch in real life. You know, I'm not making any adjustments because this is a tutorial. I'm showing you what I really do. And I like using circular needles because, as I mentioned on the last video, I find them very versatile. You can knit flat using them, you can knit in large circumferences, and you can knit in small, tiny circumferences by doing magic loop. So they are just very conducive to lots of different knitting styles and techniques for whatever your pattern calls for. You might think that pulling the knitting across the cord is a little bit counterproductive and that it could be a little bit easier with a double pointed needle, such as what I've got here, because it's a lot shorter. So as I knit my stitches to the end, I wouldn't have to push them along such a long cable. You know, I could just push them along a little bit, drape the yarn behind, knit, and then just drape the yarn behind on this much narrower tool compared to the long cable of the circular. So you could create your swatch in the round using a double pointed needle, but only if you have exactly the same brand, style and material of double pointed needle as the circular needle, if that's what you're going to be doing, right? So if you're going to be making a hat, for example, only using double pointed needles, then sure, swatch using the double pointed needles. But if you're just watching this video thinking that you need to swatch for another type of project in the round, maybe it's a yoked sweater, and you're thinking, oh, maybe it's more straightforward just to do the swatch on a double pointed needle of the same size, just be wary because the actual different types of needles themselves can affect your tension and your gauge. So if you're using a different needle for your swatch and your final project, the swatch would technically become irrelevant, right? So you can swatch on a double pointed needle as long as you're going to be using that for the project, or if you have exactly the same brand of circulars and double pointed needles, you know, if you also had the same metal with the same coating, with the same shape and style of the tip. Because you're actually doing your knitting using the very edge of the needle, right? The rest of the length is just holding the stitches, but you're doing all of the manipulation and the control using the very end. So obviously these two tools are different sizes. I don't have a double pointed needle in this 6.5mm size, which is why I just picked up another one to show you, but you get the idea. Create your swatch using the same or as similar as possible tools as you would do for your finished piece. So here's my piece of work so far. I've got just over an inch or about 3 or 4 centimeters or so of stocking stitch there. I've got my border at the end, the last stitch being very sloppy, but it's not bothering me at all. And I've got the tails dangling at the back that, as you can see, are just slightly longer than the width of the piece so that it's not pulling it too much, so that it's not puckering the fabric. As I explained briefly at the beginning, if you aren't bothered about saving your yarn or possibly needing to unravel it, then you don't have to leave such a large length at the back. You can make it a bit smaller because you can cut it open here in the middle at the end in order to make it lie flat. So now I'm just going to get on with knitting my swatch, and I'll get back to you when I finish off, when it's square. Now I've knit up my square, and it's really interesting to compare this to the first swatch that I knit flat, because I really do feel like the tension is much firmer, a little bit tighter, and I feel like I can visually see that the stitches are just a fraction smaller. Also, you can see how loose and sloppy the stitches are at the side. And that doesn't bother me at all, as I said, because I'm just going to ignore them. So let's cast off the swatch so that we can measure and compare. So I'm going to do another little garter stitch edge. Again, I'm going to knit it flat. So instead of pulling the yarn across to the front, and I'm just going to turn the work, and I'm going to knit all the way across. Turn my work. Now I'm looking at the right side, and I can see that row of bumps that's forming my first garter stitch ridge. Now that I'm back to the wrong side, I'm going to cast off knitwise fairly loosely. I don't want to be yanking the yarn too tight because, again, that will distort my swatch and distort my tension. And I'm casting off knitwise on the wrong side so that I get my garter stitch ridges across to the right side, and this is allowing me to save a little bit of time. And there we have it. That's my swatch with its octopus legs at the back. And because I kept all of this slack at the back, I'm able to spread my swatch out on a flat surface. The loops at the back aren't pulling it together. Now let's measure the swatch and make a quick comparison between the tension of my swatch in the round and my swatch flat. So my stitches came out an average of 15 stitches per 10 centimetres or 4 inches, and my rows came out at an average of 20 per 10 centimetres or 4 inches. So that's working out more or less the same as the flat swatch that I first knitted when I took the initial measurements. Actually ended up the same, which I didn't realise, but that's quite interesting. And the stitch gauge is very slightly tighter than the recommended tension from the yarn manufacturer, West Yorkshire Spinners, who suggested that the yarn should be knit at 14 stitches per 10 centimetres, but it's possible that the fabric would again relax after blocking. So the next step would be to wet block this swatch and then let it dry and take the measurements just like I did for my flat swatch. If you wanted to completely open out your swatch, now would be the time to cut down the middle and just open it all out. I'm not going to be showing the blocking in today's video. Instead, I'm going to sign off. This video comes as part of a video series all about swatching. And the next video coming up in the series is going to be answering some questions that I've been having about swatches, some questions to do about tension differences and gauge differences. So if you have a question, please do drop me a comment on YouTube and I'll do my best to cover it in the next video in this series. This video comes to you courtesy of all of my lovely patrons over on Patreon who support the Crimson Stitchery through a monthly subscription in exchange for exclusive content. If this is something that tickles your fancy, do head over to patreon.com/thecrimsonstitchery to choose the right tier for you. Thank you so much to all of my patrons. Your support really means a lot in developing the content for this channel, helping it be better and better, and also providing the kind of content and resources that my viewers so enjoy and frequently request. Thank you so much. Please do hit the thumbs up and like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already so that you don't miss out on any future videos. Thanks so much for watching. Happy knitting. Bye bye.